Well, hello, creatives, community, and kind folks. Welcome to RPG with DBJ, and I am your host, DBJ. Thank you very much for joining me on this Discord Tuesday. Just as a preamble, just be aware that this show is simulcast over on Twitch, YouTube, and our own Discord server each day, Monday through Friday, and we take a subject. That subject could be just about anything, and we talk about it in relation to tabletop RPGs. And this week we're talking about science fantasy. And whatever subject we talk about, that we talk about all week, we will subdivide it. Yesterday was Monster Monday. Today is Discord Tuesday, where we talk about mechanics and mechanical options or problems or things when it comes to some of our most popular or favorite or home rules for our tabletop games. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page as well, we're talking about science fantasy, where the blending of science fiction and fantasy is we're using that for our tabletop games. Essentially, it's the age before there was a split between science fiction and fantasy, where laser pistol in one hand, sword in the other, maybe a little bit of the pulp action or even cinematic action from an age where there was an age of discovery in literature and such. Now, I will make a point that, much like the Lovecraftian era, there were some problematic depictions of, let's say, the browner you were, the more savage you were. Some of these people back in those times during some of the pulp era were had some despicable views, but we're pulling upon things today, the better parts of those things today. And much like anything from intellectual properties from a little known but one of my favorite movies, The Rocketeer, all the way into Star Wars, we're talking about the blending of the two together. So yesterday we were talking about the idea of we ended with 80s and 90s serials and 80s and 90s cartoons to go along with those things, like Thundar the Barbarian and Black Star and Silverhawks and a host of others. What was someone put in a link for like 25? I think it was Deadman put in a link for 25 well-known, popular 80s and 90s cartoons. And one of the things, since we will be talking about mechanics today, one of the things that you can do if you're someone who wants to incorporate this, especially into, say, something like Dungeons and Dragons or what have you, is you can actually make the case that science and fantasy are already mixed into Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, short of literally placing in firearms into Dungeons and Dragons, there's already living constructs and alchemy and artificers or artificer mechanisms and artifacts and all those kind of good things. Matter of fact, if you want to go, if you're an old grognardian like myself, you can go back to devices like the folding boat or the apparatus of Qualish or any number of other pseudo-mechanical devices and things, some of them belching out steam or smoke or I don't know, gem-powered diesel engines or things of that nature. So there is that part. But one mechanical way to split the two is to require some kind of knowledge or skill between, say, arcana and magic and like some kind of mechanical skill, right? Like if a creature or a device or player character is some kind of mechanical creature, a great way to differentiate the two is that you need medicine to heal a human being, or a biological creature, but you need some kind of mechanical skill to like repair or build or modify some kind of mechanical object and whatnot. And that's a pretty easy way to split the two as well. Another way to add some like mechanical features and whatnot is to have different side effects, even though you may have the same gaming mechanics. So an example would be like a wizard or something casts like a magic missile, requires certain kinds of like components and spell components or whatever, but maybe the mechanical version of the same thing, like a pistol or something that shoots the exact same magic missile, may have different side effects or requirements to use said thing, right? Um, uh, in Star Wars, there is I guess there are basically two mechanisms I can think of, possibly three mechanisms that deal with like the force and kyber crystals and such. Going with the kyber crystal part of it, the crystals are a like an economy, right? You need this material to build these lightsabers or something, and each of them has their own, you bleed the crystal or something, or you somehow your emotional state somehow in building the lightsabers requires you to be in tune with it or whatnot. And in a mechanical sense, it means that there is a difference between, say, a factory trying to build a lightsaber versus an individual skilled who has those skills. So that's one way of doing it. The other part of it is, for example, with the force, there's a possibility like if you use the force, someone else will detect you using it. Maybe there's like a residue of you using this air quotes magical ability when you use it within the context of a science fiction setting, much like um, mental abilities and psionics is the magic of science fiction usually, especially in harder sci-fi. It seems to be the go-to trope of if we if we evolve and advance ourselves far enough into the future that some kind of like psychic ability or something will be may evolve naturally or could come from devices or injections or genetic manipulation or something of that nature. And so applying some sort of limiting factor can turn the dial on how powerful or how useful or how common one part of what you're adding in is. So an example would be in a fantasy setting, if you wanted to include technology but you didn't want it to run rampant, you could say that it's unreliable, or the materials are hard to come by, or the individuals who have the knowledge to build such things, such technological marvels in your world are rare, or the people who created them in the first place are now gone. So there's only a handful of these things left, and if they're destroyed, there's no way to rebuild them, or the mechanism that powers such devices are hard to come by or are unstable in some manner, much like the idea of using elementals that are captured to power devices. Once the elementals are released, and either for your benefit, hope just want to go back home. But if they're pissed off, they get out of control. Maybe that's the limiting factor on why say in Eberron, there aren't 50,000 airships plus, and there's building them out of factories, because to power them is to court a danger that requires lots of ingenuity and personnel, and you know time and place might be very important. So there are ways to control it. And I've always made the argument that we as role players are a little bit too brilliant for our own good, because we know that in our own world that firearms and the like technology and such has kind of strangely has would remove the need for any age of fantasy. Not that we've even had an age of fantasy in our own real world, but you get the point. But I make the contention that sure, given a long enough time period, yeah, of course, technology and firearms and automobiles and computers have changed the landscape in the world that we know. But if you take a snapshot of any period of time in the past, the people living through that period of time wouldn't know that and may not even be convinced that such a thing would happen. There wasn't a 5 minute period of time when someone was like, "Oops, firearms! I guess we're gonna have to take our armor off and drop the swords." Right? It was probably 150, 250, 300 years period of time before it became before firearms became the dominant weapon of choice, because there were still people riding on horses with swords and things during, like, what was it, World War I or something, riding into battle. There were paintings and photographs and stuff of people doing that with like gas masks on and sabers and all that kind of business. So yeah, the people living through it, and most of the time, we let's be honest, do we really, take our player characters through 175 years of societal changes? Probably not. We usually have a couple of years, and that's a very small snapshot. So I wouldn't be afraid of adding in technology into fantasy, or vice versa, adding in fantastical elements into your science fiction. Definitely on Future Friday, we're going to talk about this. Like, an example would be if you are a fan of The Expanse. The Expanse has, a hard sci-fi science fiction solar system, but you've thrown in this alien technology that is pretty much very, very misunderstood, and people are still trying to figure it out. Yet they're using it, so pretty good thing. Other mechanical aspects, of course, would be, and when I say mechanical, um, capital M mechanical, meaning like game effects, gamified things. Again, are applying. Another way to do it is to not apply any mechanical differences at all. So for um, superhero role playing games, embrace this to the nth degree, whereas maybe other games like science fiction or fantasy gaming does not. And that is the idea that um, most of your superhero role playing games apply statistics, and then they layer on top of that the narrative that you want to express. So, an example would be, going back to like the magic missile idea. In a lot of superhero games, they just basically like, oh, here is here's a blast power, and then you apply like descriptors on top of the blast power based on your character. Is your blast power from a pair of pistols on your hip? Is your blast power from your power armor from the palm of your hand? Is your blast power from a gem in the middle of your forehead? It's a bunch of those things, right? It's basically descriptors, and some of those descriptors have a mechanical effect. So I have blast power, and I'm applying the condition of cold to it, or fire, or electricity. Some even get rid of those descriptors and go, okay, my blast power can stun people or paralyze them, or trap them, entangle them, and I'm going to skin it as cold. Or my blast power, once it hits, continues to hurt the person. I'm going to skin it as fire. And the same thing could be done if you want to use that kind of technique for, like, taking, say, something like classic fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons, and using it to build technology and cybernetics or something. You could just very easily reskin and reflavor some of the powers and special abilities that are in it, and just reskin them as like magical things and such. Like, hey, I've got my character has a cyber arm, and I my magic comes from my cyber arm, and just reskin it and reflavor it and such. Um, Dead Man puts in Clark's three laws. British science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke formulated three adages that are known as Clarke's three laws, of which the third law is the best known and most widely cited. Yep, they are part of his ideas and extensive writings about the future. These so-called laws are, yep, and I remember that last one. But anyway, the first one is when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. Yeah. The only way of discovering the limits, this is the second one, sorry. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And then, of course, the last and most well-known one is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And how many times have we argued about like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? And Thor, and Thor says, well, it's just basically technology that people don't understand, and it seems like magic to you. And then, of course, Odin is like speaks into the hammer, like whosoever shall be worthy shall have the power of Thor. And how many arguments are like, well, who can pick up the hammer? Can a machine pick up the hammer? And if Thor isn't worthy, but somebody else is, but they're not as strong as him, do they get the hammer? And I mean, those are little silly arguments that we go through where we're not understanding that it works because it does, right? Like sometimes things don't need to be explained. Sometimes they just work because they do. And the idea of magic, of course, is lowercase m magic for those who are not into like science fiction and role playing and things. That the common person, magic is something that is not understood in its entirety, right? And so you can very easily put in something that's in your game world that people don't understand. The Stargates from, well, Stargate is a perfect example, right? Or wormholes are another one that people don't understand, that they exist. We know a small portion of what it does. Hey, go through the wormhole, you come out the other end, but where they come from, who manipulates them, how do you create them? The Stargates are a perfect example of a wormhole. Hey, if you poke and prod it this way, it opens up a doorway to another place. Great, okay, but who built them? What kind of power is used to actuate them? And of course, Pet Ogre is like magnets. Yeah, sometimes you don't need to explain these things, and I think we again are far more brilliant than we need to be. Sometimes some things don't need to be explained, even though even your players may be asking questions about such a thing, because mystery allows us to develop further stories. And the more we explain something, the more we start to define what it is. And it moves away from the realm of magic into science, right? So, explaining why an abandoned starship that has no power has gravity in it, it's not necessary. And sometimes not explaining it actually opens up more things for yeah, sometimes explaining things actually limits what it is in the first place, because if it, the mysterious alien artifact, if the aliens actually came down and explained to us the science of it, it might be like, wait, so that's all it is? Right? I remember reading a science fiction book, and there was it was like alien artifact things left on a planet that were like these walls from like an ancient alien civilization or something. And come to find out at the end of the book, like it was basically alien trash they had left behind, but their trash was like their emotional it was like their emotional baggage or something they left behind. That's all it was. It was just like basically trash on a planet. But humanity was like, what is it? We need to discover it. We need to use it. We need to make it a weapon. We need to. Somebody ended up finding out like, So you guys ascended to a different level of consciousness and you left behind your baggage? Like, it's literally trash? What the hell? Yeah, I like that dead man. His little meme like, you don't have a skeleton inside of you. You're a brain. You are inside of a skeleton. You're piloting a bone mech that's using meat armor. What? Yep. Yeah. When you recontextualize something, sometimes you go, wait, what? Yep. Yeah, Tesla Rage. Yeah, we've become energy beings. We don't need our powered armor anymore. Exactly. Wait, what? Powered armor? Huh? What? Exactly. Right. Depends on how you look at things. Other other beings or individuals might not look at it the same way, and of course, it becomes very, very mysterious to the rest of us. Something else as well when it comes to mixing magic and technology is the idea of like being able to pull on the threads of both. Mixing science and technology allows us to pull on the threads of both of them, both science and technology at the same time. So the science part of it to me is not necessarily, you know, uppercase S science where it's literally like scientific development, but it's really predicted outcomes, right? Such as like uh, if I cast this magic spell, I know exactly what's going to happen at the end of it. Now, what happens might not be scientific, but we know that hey, whenever I cast a spell, my eyes glow and my hair changes color or something, right? It could be something as simple as that. Hey, when I cast this spell, it makes a lot of noise and leaves behind some sort of residue or something. So if you know this is going to happen, that's pretty much the science part of it. Hey, um, do A, then you know, side effect B happens, and then C, the thing that I'm looking for, also happens. The magic part of it is the unexplained, and it when it comes to role playing games, for the most part, like 99% of the time, when it comes to player characters, we want things explained, and there's very little mystery involved in it. Usually, the mystery comes from like random effects, like random effect tables. Hey, if I use my mental powers, I roll on the psychic random effect table or something. And if you want to include more mystery into like player character capabilities that are forward facing, that's the best way to do it. To You could go very gonzo, like the uh, the chaos, sorcerer kind of thing, where hey, when I cast a spell, I could possibly polymorph into a goat, or create a wall of ice, or summon a sack of potatoes, or something dumb like that. Or you could get more subtle with it, where it could have varying levels of uh, inner or outer disruptions, like passing out, or going blind, or falling unconscious, or becoming paralyzed, or being unable to turn the power off, or affecting someone else who has a side effect of having that ability, or something like that, right? Like, much like the classic, and when I say classic, we're going back in like the 60s and 70s of the X-Men, where all of the X-Men mutants they had special ability, but then they also had that. There was one thing that they really couldn't get a hold of. I've got psychic powers, but sometimes I can't turn them off, and I'm reading everyone's mind all at the same time, and it's giving me a headache. Or, hey, I can polymorph my body. I can change my shape, but I don't know if I'll be able to change back again if I lose control, or something like that. So, if you really want to add in some kind of mystery into the world, something chaotic, something misunderstood, that's the best way to do it. And I think by incorporating the random chance that something may go wrong, or there might be some random side effect or whatever, could limit how much you want to put into it. Like, the example being that you could do the exact same thing with technology as well. Um, like, hey, kitty, you're around my court there, kitty. Yeah, sorry guys. Hey, Sophie, thank you. Like for example, if you in your classic fantasy realm, if you wanted to add in technology from an alien world, or your gnomish population is very much into gnomes, and dwarves are into like steam powered devices or something. If they randomly break down or require a lot of maintenance or something like that, that's a good way to control it. And then again, with like mental powers or magic or otherworldly institutions and such, that's the best way to control them. Also, when it comes to the mechanics, I think um, again, probably trying to find out. Uh, I think sometimes we look at the descriptor as opposed to we're looking at the wrong end of the equation. So, hey, Cameron. Sometimes the equation has to deal with what are we looking at how the person got there or the result of what they want to do. So, an example would be um, someone wants to mind control an enemy, right? They want to mind control them some kind of way. So, do we worry about the mechanism, how they got the mind control, or do we want to know the success or failure of the mind control and then describe it, figure out how we're going to describe it? So, what I mean by that is a player character wants to, what's a common spell like charm person, right? And this, using Dungeons and Dragons as our example, character wants to have used charm person, and now we could describe it any way we want, and I think that would be the best way to do it. Hey, my character has the spell charm person, and but I don't want it to be a spell. I want it to be like I'm a stage musician and I have the skill in charming someone by using, swinging the watch back and forth, or using um a certain intonation with my voice, or I tap them on the back of the neck or something like that, right? Like that could be a very easy way to describe how someone does it. It could be something technological like um, incense, or um, I don't know, a magical flute, or I don't know, um, whatever the case may be. It could be a potion or some kind of elixir that I put into their food to charm them. But then there's the other side of the equation, the other side of it, where someone says, well, I want to charm that person, but I don't want it to be a spell like effect. And then we say, well, then it's not charm person. You have to have something else because we have to describe it some other kind of way. Where I feel like, I'm a big proponent of like not really changing games too much and having to come up with like a lot of funky home rules. I think just figure out how you want to get there and then backtrack in how we describe what it is. So if you want to charm someone, is it because your eyes glow, or is it the tone of your voice, or those kind of things? I think all that is just more flavor than anything, and that's pretty much free. We can do that. You can reskin, reflavor, repurpose anything in most role playing games to fit what we want to do, rather than having to try to come up with a whole bunch of funky home rules, which is probably my contention with players who are like, I want psionics in D&D. Why aren't there a whole bunch of brand new rules for it? I'm like, it already exists in the game. We just don't call it that, but it's already there. There's a million and one things from the first edition out to fifth edition plus Pathfinder. You don't need separate rules for psionics, but it's a thing. It's old bones. Uh, I remember having the AD&D player's handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, and flipping to the back and having it like 98% chance of actually getting psionics and all that kind of stuff. So, and again, that's a pretty good example of like having a thing in the world that's unexplained and different and odd and unique, inserted into the world where it becomes it ends up becoming the new norm in, say, a setting like Dark Sun. So yeah. Um, so with science fantasy, also, and this is a weirdism in science fantasy, um, there's a little bit of accepting that things are the way they are because that's the way they are in science fantasy. Let me make this probably will flow more into world building, but an example would be when you have, say, like laser pistols and swords and things like that, and you've got your bare chested hero running around fighting the savages and stuff. Sometimes we might be scratching our heads, going, "Okay, they've got laser pistols and swords. Why do they need the swords again?" Right? Like that might be a logical reasoning, right? Like what? Okay, so they've got anti gravity technology, but they only use it to ride on, like, I don't know, mechanical, you know, aero vehicles that float across the ground. Like they wouldn't use this technology to escape their planet or make floating cities or make giant tanks or something like that. And sometimes we have to part of the cinematography. I don't know. That's wrong. The part of the cinematics of swords and like sorcery and science fiction and stuff is just accepting the fact that, all right, guys, we're going to just assume that this is the way things are. Like we talked about Star Wars yesterday, right? Like, mono biome worlds, it's a thing. We're not going to explain it. We're not going to go into physics. That's the magical. That's the, out of the science and the fantasy part. That's the fantasy part. So just accept it. The gravity inside of starships, yeah, that's we're just going to accept that. The lack of time dilation, yep, don't even worry about it. It's just part of the world. It's the fantasy part of the world. It's the predictable but non mysterious part of our fantasy, and then we also have the idea of oh, how do I explain this? It's the things move and function as the need of the plot, right? Like why does the hyperspace drive not work? Well, because the plot has to happen. So there is a little bit, not a, well, maybe more than a little bit. There's a lot of bit of science fantasy where we want the world to. When I say the world, it doesn't necessarily need to be one planet, but we want our setting to be a certain way. And sure, stretching it out over a period of time, it might not make sense, but in this period of time, this is the way things are, right? Like, for example, there is an old miniatures game that I still love the setting that it was built for, called Crimson Skies, and it was basically an extrapolation from like the 1920s during the Great Depression. And instead of highways being built, it was an alternate future where the United States was split up, and everything is with like airships and prop planes, right? And and the whole game is set around these like two-fisted, aerialists, flying planes fighting each other. The Hollywood Knights fighting the Empire State, fighting the uh, different people in between, and all this kind of business. And sure, you're thinking, well, if the world has the technology to build, say, airships and flying craft, why wouldn't they have the capabilities to build highways and cars, right? But you have to go, well, listen, it's a snapshot. In this particular day and age, this is what we're going to do. So there is a function of science fantasy where things don't make sense, and it's okay. It's all right. Don't get your feelings hurt. Don't go down the deep dive of this doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't make sense, and we accept that it doesn't make sense, right? Um, so like Thor and Asgard, right? There's the Bifrost Bridge, and the Bifrost Bridge is basically a wormhole or something like that, and no one ever explains. Like, wait a minute, so you can only get into and out of Asgard through the Bifrost Bridge, but you can teleport yourself off of any other realm? Why can't you just appear, disappear anywhere you want onto Asgard? Right? No one explains it. It just is. It just is. So, yep. Um, Yep. And Ogre says, well, there was the split of the states into actual nations, nations that disliked each other, so the highways weren't built because of that. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And talk about Crimson Skies. Yeah, the there was never a highway system because all the states split into nations, and there was no particular reason for them to build a countrywide highway system because that meant literally that they would have to accommodate each other, but within their own areas they didn't do that either, really, or to an extent. Yes. And Ogre says, if you like the idea of that setting, however, you should have a look at Flying Circus, quite a new game built with a modified powered by the apocalypse. I did not know that. I mean, I, I'm sure when I brought that up that there's at least one or two other systems that use a similar setting aesthetic, but I didn't know which ones they were. But I didn't know Flying Circus. Okay. Um, there's but when it comes to like alternate timelines or like alternate history settings or much like Shadowrun is a perfect example, right? Where magic comes about during a noirish cyber technological society, and of course we have trolls and orcs and ogres and dragons and magic and such, and that of course incorporates the two and has a blending of the two, and there it is, flying circus, biplanes and shooting at each other and dragons and stuff. Yep, of avian fantasy. Yep. uh I like mixing those kind of things together, the fantasy and the technology and such. um yeah, and Cameron says, well, how futuristic does your science portion need to be to make science fantasy? um I a weird as an armchair chair talking head, I think the fantasy part of it is something that cannot be explained by any of the science, right? Like we kind of brought up, a classic trope in science fiction is psychic powers. We have no standard by which to measure psychic powers today, but it's also an accepted trope that it's the thing that would happen in the future in a lot of science fiction. So, and mind you, Clark's third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So it would be something that operates. It might have maybe a portion of it that we understand. Hey, if we go through the Stargate, we arrive at another galaxy, right? We don't know who built it. We don't know how it's built. We don't know how it's powered. We don't know how to duplicate it. We only know that if we go through this one Stargate, we end up in this other galaxy. And so you could have something predictable about technology, but have no way of explaining it, and explaining how it works. And again, like yesterday, brought up Numenera and that idea of like, is it nanotechnology? Is it powered from satellites? Is it mutation? And the answer is like all of the above, but none of the above, or bits and pieces of the above. Yeah, Dead Man puts in the link. Yeah, Flying Circus, role playing of high flying adventure, powered by the apocalypse game of mercenary fighter pilots surviving their high stress career in a world of machines and magic. And I think I've seen it before, but I didn't remember the name of it. Um, although I I like Crimson Skies, the aesthetic of it, because they move past the biplanes to the single to the uh, swept back and swept forward plane aesthetic. I just happen to like that. I can't tell you what the quality of the game is, but I like that aesthetic with the propellers in the front or the back, and they kind of look like aerodynamic and stuff, and all that kind of business. But whatever, that's just a personal desire of mine. But um, the mixing of the science and fantasy portions um, is like a dial, right? Like where are you do you want more of the science where we're like spacemen and we're leaving our own solar system and oh we're adding a sprinkle of fantasy, or are we going the other way where it's like a fantastical world with magic and elves and dragons, and we just happen to have um, science in it, like a starship or alien race lands on the planet or something. But there uh, long before we made a split in all this, there was never a split between science and fantasy. There was just like, hey, we're going to go to Mars and we're going to be John Carter of Mars with anti-gravity ships and laser weapons and swords and magical powers and strange creatures, right? There was a period of time where there wasn't a split between the two, and there's nothing wrong with that. I find that there's it's perfectly acceptable to just say, sure, there's technology and there's magic. I think we are the people who desire to explain things. And the more, again, the more you explain something, the more you take away the fantasy of it. The more you take away the thing that works because it does, without explaining to people why it is that way. Um, in the recent WotC release, Mystic Odysseys of Theros, whatever the case may be. Anyway, it's about like it's loosely based on like Greek heroes and Greek mythology and things of that nature. And you know, for us, we want to explain that there's a sun and our planet, you know, moves around the star system, and we want to explain like geology and astrophysics and all that kind of business. Where you know maybe Apollo rides his chariot across the sky every day. That's where the sun comes from, right? Like things may the seasons change because I don't know which of the mythological stories where someone very beautiful goes down into the underworld for 6 months and then has to come back. They made a deal, and that's why the seasons change, and it turns Dionysus or something. I don't know the names, but you know the mythological story of the leaves leaves the mortal world, goes down into I got an angry cat now who absolutely positively wants to be on camera. Um, so leaves the mythological world. I mean, leaves the physical world, goes into the underworld. Then we get wintertime, and then Hades has to agree to let her back out, and all that kind of business. Maybe that's the way the cosmology works, right? Um, we don't necessarily have to have settings where we explain everything, or that everything works in a manner in which our modern day science tells us it is supposed to work. And I think pulling on those threads allows us to add that fantasy into our science, and then maybe even having some mystery as to how things work for our fantasy to have some more mystery into it, right? Um, a good example to me is just basically magic systems. Most and it needs to be this way, but most magic systems are they're pretty scientific, right? If I've got 7 points to make use this spell, and when I do it, a thing happens, and we're done. Right? There's usually very little mystery as to what might happen if I do a thing. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't game systems that have something like that, where, like, what did I listened to a review of the RPG system, Low Fantasy Gaming, and it uses a D20 system where if you cast a spell, if you roll a one, something that you might not like will happen. If you cast a second spell, if you roll a one or a two, something might not happen. And every time you cast a spell, that you roll a d20, and it keeps adding up. If you cast three spells, if you roll a one, two, or three, you get the point, right? So there's like there's a resource mechanic dealing with a resource mechanic that deals with the side effects of magic that might have undesired consequences. And it can be pretty easy to incorporate something like that into a game world where, hey, I want magic in my world, but I don't want it to act like I don't want my character spamming. I don't want my character spamming. Jesus, kitty. Get down. Wow. And I'm bleeding. Sorry about that, guys. Sorry about that. Kitty, come on, sit down. There you go. Oof. Wow. You would think that it would be easier for me just to close the door, but no, because you would never be able to hear me from the screaming from the outside that, oh man, the cat just hurt her human. Oof. All right, I'll deal with that later. But um, there's a mystery that's there's a mechanical mystery. Sure. Do we know that our feline friends have strange personalities? Yeah, it's bleeding. Oh man. Sure. It is predicted. It is a predicted unpredictability when it comes to our feline friends. And yep, there she is, just sitting there looking at me like, I'm gonna get you back. Yeah, go ahead, human. You better feed me. Oh, so funny. Anyway, yeah, I made the mistake of not paying attention to her because I'm looking at the computer screen. She's like, it can't be more important than I am, which, in many ways, I guess that kind of embraces the idea that would have been good for a Monster Monday thing about like monsters and creatures that are predictably chaotic in their behavior. That, like, okay, the science of it is we know that they act strange, but the fantasy, the mystery of it is we don't know why they act the way they do, right? But moving back, I guess a little bit more into mechanics as well, is especially if you're like a game designer, is trying to find out to create the spaces where story and mystery can happen. So for a lot of rules light systems, it's an accepted part of rules light systems that we don't have the rules to dictate what's going to happen when we come upon one of those like one-off things. Like you can have a rules light system, and we're like, ooh, there's no rules for suffocation. How are we going to decide how this works? And so with a rules light system, you can just say, well, in this particular context, it's going to work this way, and everyone agrees to it. Whereas maybe when you come back to the table, if everyone's agreed, you know what? Remember that ruling that we came up with? I think I've got a better idea. And a lot of times with rules light systems, people can create like micro worlds within the rules light systems, and the same interaction with the world starts changing when the rules start changing with you. GURPS is actually a really good example of this as well. Um, uh, some people call GURPS very crunchy, but that's something that you can actually modulate on your own. The more books you start pulling in the GURPS, the worse it gets. But then once you start pulling in different books, they have different rules based on how you interact with those worlds, right? So every book is basically a different world, essentially, um, uh, with all the supplemental material, and that's a great way of like taking like a rules heavy game, and saying, okay, well, you know what? Here's how things are going to change in the future. I brought up Torg. Rifts is all right with that, but Torg is actually even um, the role playing game Torg is even better with that, where you are in a science fantasy style world where different portals have opened up on Earth, and the way you interact with the world changes based on where you're at. And that could be a pretty good way of like establishing like, oh, okay, so my I know 90% of what my capabilities are as a player, but the other 10% might be based on where I'm at, or it could be based on mindset, or it could be based on time factors. Heck, it could be even based on, how you woke up that morning, right? There are some games, like I have a game called Dream Chaser, and in Dream Chaser, it is very much like, um, it's a it has an engine that works, but part of the game is designing what the setting is like. So every character has their own mechanisms for how they interact with the world, but then there's this thing that you overlay on top of it that changes it based on what everyone agrees on. So, like it's called Dream Chaser for a reason, because you can make your own meta dreams, which basically is dreams is a standing for like what type of game we're going to play. Like, we're going to play an ultra gritty noir detective where we go hunt after a serial killer. Okay, well, here are the rules we agree on how we're going to interact. Oh, okay, great. This is what we're going to do. And there's actually rules for making those rules, if that makes sense. And uh, so I think as a game designer, finding a place, the balance between how much predictability or science you want and how much unpredictability and fantasy you want in your world. And I mean that as a meta challenge, rather than one that is a specific challenge. Like the game Cyberpunk is very, very stable, right? There's not very much mystery in how you interact with the rules or how you interact with the setting. A gun is a gun, a cyber arm is a cyber arm, etc. But there are times when you can add in a little bit of the fantasy, like an AI that has some, like, God's eye view of the world and can do things that essentially, air quotes, break the rules of the game and of the world, right? Or um, a starship that finds some alien artifact out there in the wild and brings it back into orbit or something. And sure, everything around the artifact is scientifically enabled, but what the artifact does, is it a conduit to another plane of existence? Is it a mind control device? Is it mutagenic? Is it um, a device that brings the subconscious to reality or something? Like, what is it doing? How does it act? How does it interact with the world? Does it have some kind of fantastical magical ability? Don't know. And that's a great way of, like, having a setting where we're just going to insert this one little thing over here to add some mystery into it. Eclipse Phase has done that, with the Pandora Gates, most especially. Um, and the Exurgent Virus is another way to add some fantasy into your hard science fiction. In Altered Carbon, the origins of from Harlan's world, the origins of the cortical stacks is an example of the fantasy inside of the science fiction, where you have this like hard sci-fi setting in different worlds, but then you have the mystery basically of like, well, who designed them and why and for what purpose? it's like, is it an excuse to have cortical stacks in that world? Sure. Um, like many things, we just go, okay, well, here are the things that we accept as reality, and then the rest of it is just us engaging in the world. But it also brings about, much like the television version of the second season of Altered Carbon, um, the origins of the people or alien race that created them in the first place. Like, where are they from? Are they going to come back? Or have they left messages? Are there side effects we haven't known about? That kind of thing. So it still leaves that up in the air as to like the fantastical elements of the game. So yeah, I suppose this could be split into like game development, world creating and setting development, character creation, I guess, getting into the nitty gritty of designing a world, and maybe being nervous incorporating some of the fantastical elements into something that is predictable might be a thing. Like, for example, would your players approve of having, any of us incorporate like random side effects for casting magic into our fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, would they accept something like that? Don't know. Maybe you could make that like a one-off, an island, someplace on the other side of that mountain range, a specific like cosmological event happen that starts to change things temporarily or permanently. And that would be a good example of like, hey, fifth edition has rules that we know, we understand how they work, we know that they are predictable. That's the science of it. But from now on, we're going to start incorporating these randomized effects based on whatever character class you are, or something like that, right? That's what you see. But anyway, World Building Wednesday is tomorrow, and we are going to build a science fantasy world. We might take bits and pieces, maybe pick from one basket and the other basket, something like that. And also, just to show support for the channel, like, share, subscribe, spread the word, follow over on Twitch, comment live, all those kind of things, interact with the channel. Sure, we'd love to support if you can. And also, by the way, for those who don't know, I am a contributing writer to Critical Hit Publishing, and we write books, for Call of Cthulhu, for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and those kind of things. So go over to Drive Through RPG, and all those links are actually down below in the doobly-doo down in the basement, and you'll see those links down there, so check that out as well. So guys, everyone, have a great weekend. I will see thee tomorrow. Bye. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great one. Bye.